Next would be your pancreatic islets. So your pancreas is a flattened, elongated gland divided into head, body, and tail portions. It is found behind the stomach, and its pancreatic duct connects to the duodenum of the small intestine. So your pancreas is both an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. So for the exocrine gland, approximately 99% of the exocrine cells of the pancreas are arranged in the clusters called acini, in which it will produce digestive enzymes. For the endocrine gland, so the endocrine tissue called your pancreatic islets or the islets of Langerhans will produce the two main hormones, your insulin and your glucagon. Its endocrine portion consists of two main groups of cells closely associated with the blood vessels. So the first group would be the alpha cells or the A cells. This will secrete glucagon that will raise the blood glucose level or raise the blood sugar level. Next, you have your beta cells or the B cells. This will secrete insulin that will lower the blood glucose level. Your delta cells or D cells will secrete your somatostatin. This will inhibit the release of your insulin and your glucagon. Last, you have your F cells. This will secrete your pancreatic polypeptide that will inhibit the release of your somatostatin. So we have a mnemonics for these three cells. Okay, it is called your gametes. Okay, so glucagon, it is secreted by your alpha cells. Your beta cells will release your insulin, and your delta cells will release your somatostatin. During the time glucose levels decrease, alpha cells in the pancreatic islets secrete the hormone glucagon. Your glucagon stimulates the liver to convert the stored glycogen into glucose, as well as the breakdown of amino acids into glucose to raise the blood sugar levels. As blood sugar levels rise, glucagon secretion decreases. This mechanism helps to prevent hypoglycemia when glucose concentration gets low as during exercise and between meals. A decline in blood glucose can cause nervous system malfunctions because glucose is the main source of energy for cells. If blood glucose levels are too high, the kidneys produce large amounts of urine containing high amounts of glucose, which can lead to dehydration. It is associated with a condition called your hyperglycemia. Increased levels of glucagon can also lead to diabetes, in which there is too much sugar or glucose in the blood. It can be that the pancreas can produce insulin or that the cells become resistant to insulin. The main function of your glucagon is to promote breakdown of molecules in order to provide energy to the cells. So in a fasted state, or when the time that the glucose levels are decreased, your pancreas or your alpha cells will release the hormone glucagon. Your glucagon doesn't have a direct effect to your skeletal muscles as well as your adipose tissues, but it can promote breakdown of triglycerides into your fatty acids and your glycerol. Your fatty acids are converted into ketones in your liver. Your ketones are essential for providing energy, while your glycerol is involved in your gluconeogenesis, or the production of new glucose molecules. In the liver, your proteins are also converted into amino acids. So those three processes here are involved in the production of glucose. Okay, so your glucose is essential for providing energy to the cells. So your glucose will now be transported into your bloodstream, thus increasing the blood glucose levels in the body. After a meal that consists primarily of carbohydrates like potatoes or rice, cereals or breads, vegetables, and salad, the blood glucose concentration becomes high due to the digestive processes. At this time, beta cells release insulin into the bloodstream. Insulin promotes the glucose in the blood to be transformed in the liver into glycogen, in which it is a stored starch. In addition, the glucose is moved into muscle cells and adipose tissue. Through negative feedback, when blood glucose levels fall, as between meals and during the night, the secretion of the insulin decreases. So the main function of your insulin is to decrease the blood glucose concentration in the blood and store it to be used as an energy source of the cells. So after consuming a meal, the blood glucose concentration becomes high due to the digestive processes. So here in the intestine, okay, you have your glucose, you have your amino acids, and you have your fats or lipids. So your glucose and your amino acids will be transported into the blood. Then your body will detect that there is an increased glucose concentration. So your pancreas, specifically your beta cell, will secrete the hormone insulin, in which your insulin will convert your glucose into your glycogen, which is a stored starch, and your amino acid into your protein in the liver. Again, the conversion of glucose to glycogen and amino acids to your protein happens in your liver. Your glycogen will also be converted into your low-density lipoprotein, and through the function of your insulin, it will convert your LDL, or your low-density lipoprotein, into your triglyceride to be stored in adipose tissues. In addition, your fats or lipid, will be taken up by your lymphatics. And with the help of your insulin will convert those fats or lipid into fatty acids to be stored in your skeletal muscles. So in short, your insulin will decrease the levels of glucose concentration in the blood to be transported to other parts or other tissues to be stored and use it as an alternative source of energy. So this would be the symptoms of patients with hypoglycemia. So the patient will manifest shaking, sweating, feeling of anxiety, dizziness, hunger, irritability, headache, weakness and fatigue. There will be impaired vision or faster heartbeat.
In diabetes mellitus, your body has trouble moving glucose, which is a type of sugar, from your blood into your cells. This leads to high levels of glucose in your blood and not enough of it in your cells. And remember that your cells need glucose as a source of energy. So not letting the glucose enter means that the cells starve for energy, despite having glucose right on their doorstep. In general, the body controls how much glucose is in the blood relative to how much gets into the cells with two hormones, insulin and glucagon. Insulin is used to reduce blood glucose levels, and glucagon is used to increase blood glucose levels. Both of these hormones are produced by clusters of cells in the pancreas called islets of Langerhans. Insulin is secreted by beta cells in the center of these islets, and glucagon is secreted by alpha cells in the periphery of the islets. Insulin reduces the amount of glucose in the blood by binding to insulin receptors embedded in the cell membrane of various insulin-responsive tissues, like muscle cells and adipose tissue. When activated, the insulin receptors cause vesicles containing glucose transporter that are inside the cell to fuse with the cell membrane, allowing glucose to be transported into the cell. Glucagon does exactly the opposite. It raises the blood glucose levels by getting the liver to generate new molecules of glucose from other molecules, and also break down glycogen into glucose so that it can all get dumped into the blood. Diabetes mellitus is diagnosed when blood glucose levels get too high, and this is seen among 10% of the world population. There are two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2, and the main difference between them is the underlying mechanism that causes the blood glucose levels to rise. Let's start with type 1 diabetes mellitus, sometimes just called type 1 diabetes. In this situation, the body doesn't make enough insulin. The reason this happens is that in type 1 diabetes, there's a type 4 hypersensitivity response, or a cell-mediated immune response, where a person's own T cells attack the pancreas. In diabetes mellitus type 1, destruction of beta cells usually starts early in life, but sometimes up to 90% of the beta cells are destroyed before symptoms crop up. 4 clinical symptoms of uncontrolled diabetes that all sound similar are polyphagia, glycosuria, polyuria, and polydipsia. Let's go through them one by one. Even though there's a lot of glucose in the blood, it cannot get into the cells, which leaves cells starved for energy. So in response, adipose tissue starts breaking down fat, called lipolysis, and muscle tissue starts breaking down proteins, both of which result in weight loss for someone with uncontrolled diabetes. This catabolic state leaves people feeling hungry, also known as polyphagia. Phagia means eating, and poly means a lot. Now, with high glucose levels, that means that when blood gets filtered through the kidneys, some of it starts to spill into the urine, called glycosuria. Glycose refers to glucose, and urea, the urine. Since glucose is osmotically active, water tends to follow it, resulting in an increase in urination, or polyuria. Poly again refers to a lot, and urea again refers to urine. Finally, because there's so much urination, people with uncontrolled diabetes become dehydrated and thirsty, or polydipsia. Poly means a lot, and dipsia means thirst. Even though people with diabetes are not able to produce their own insulin, they can still respond to insulin. So treatment involves lifelong insulin therapy to regulate their blood glucose levels and basically enable their cells to use glucose. Now let's switch gears and talk about type 2 diabetes, which is where the body makes insulin, but the tissues don't respond as well to it. The exact reason why cells don't respond isn't fully understood. Essentially, the body's providing the normal amount of insulin, but the cells don't move their glucose transporters to their membrane in response, which remember is needed for the glucose to get into the cells. These cells therefore have insulin resistance. Some risk factors for insulin resistance are obesity, lack of exercise, and hypertension. So genetic factors probably play a major role as well. In type 2 diabetes, since tissues don't respond as well to normal levels of insulin, the body ends up producing more insulin in order to get the same effect and move glucose out of the blood. They do this through beta cell hyperplasia, an increased number of beta cells, and beta cell hypertrophy, where they actually grow in size, all in this attempt to pump out more insulin. This works for a while, and by keeping insulin levels higher than normal, blood glucose levels can be kept normal, called normoglycemia. And over time, those maxed out beta cells get exhausted, and they become dysfunctional, and undergo hypertrophy, and get smaller, as well as hypoplasia and die off. As beta cells are lost and insulin levels decrease, glucose levels in the blood start to increase, and patients develop hyperglycemia, which leads to similar clinical signs that we mentioned before, like polyphagia, glycosuria, polyuria, and polydipsia.
So to summarize the pancreatic islet hormones, your glucagon will increase your blood sugar level, your insulin will decrease the blood sugar level, your somatostatin will inhibit the secretion of both of the insulin and the glucagon hormones, and your pancreatic polypeptide will inhibit the release of your somatostatin.